Hey, welcome back to the Uttermost Road, and greetings from Fort Smith, Montana, which is really about a mile or so on the other side of that lake. And I'm also on the Crow Indian Reservation. So as the Crow say in their language, Shodaje. And hopefully I got that right. And if I got it wrong, I'm hoping some of my Crow friends out there will get a hold of me and set me straight. But anyway, welcome to the pilot episode of what I'm calling Views from the Road. It's going to be a new page and a new feature on my website where I'll have little video clips like this and just speaking to you and sharing from my heart and things I'm thinking about. And today, I want to start off by talking to you about the Gospel of John. I've been spending a lot of time in that Gospel in the last few weeks and months. And so I want to kind of give an overview and a couple of key things that has John captivated as he writes his Gospel. And now, if you're not familiar or very familiar with the New Testament, it starts off with 4 books that are referred to as the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And within those Gospels, each of these different authors basically records and writes about the life of Jesus from his birth to his death and resurrection. And the things he said, the places he went, his teachings, the miracles. But you got to remember, when you read the Gospels, it's just not just plain, boring, matter-of-fact history. These are stories written from a personal perspective. People who knew Jesus, who saw him, and so they're sharing from their own experience as well as kind of laying it out there for us. There's also a personal element, a personal style, and a personal perspective in each one of the Gospels. Now the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are the most similar. You can actually put them in columns and line them up to see where they're alike and where they're a little different, where there's gaps, where they're totally different, where they're almost identical. And so the first 3 are like that. And Mark was the first one written, even though it's second in order, and it's the shortest one. Matthew and Luke are longer Gospels, and they probably were familiar with Mark and took from Mark and then added their own and this sort of thing. So that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark begins his story with the baptism of Jesus and John the Baptist. Matthew and Luke, on the other hand, they go back to Jesus' birth. They start with the genealogy, where Jesus came from, the human bloodline. Now John, on the other hand, scholars say, was written last. As a matter of fact, decades later, John was an old man when he wrote his Gospel, some 60 years after the life of Jesus. And so John, I think, is the most different from the other 3. In fact, there are stories and accounts and sayings and teachings in John's Gospel that aren't in the other 3. So keep in mind, though, that here's John some 60 years after he walked with Jesus for 3 years as a disciple. And he's getting old and he's thinking, okay, it's my turn. What is it I want my readers to know about Jesus? And I just don't want to do what Matthew, Mark, and Luke did. You know, they're synoptic, like they're almost the same in some ways. I don't want to do that. I want to do something a little different. And he looks back to when he was with Jesus, some 60 years. He draws upon 60 years or so of experience not only as a disciple of Jesus for 3 years, but then he became an apostle and a leader in the New Testament church for all those years. So he draws upon all that experience. And more significantly, the experience that he has with the risen, resurrected Jesus, and his growth and his maturity and his continuing awareness of that living Jesus. And he's saying, okay, what is it that's most important that I want to share in my gospel? So he sits down 60 years later, old man, probably can hardly see, and pins this out for us. So here's a few things that I want you to see that I'll share in this segment. Again, the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, basically focused on the life of Jesus, his earthly life for 33 some years. That's what most people think, 33 years or so. Whereas John, he seemed to be captivated by the question or the, wondering, where did Jesus come from before Bethlehem, before the Christmas story? Where did he come from? And so, in John 1:1, his first time to the plate, first swing, man, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos of God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He, the Word, the Logos, was with God. And so he's fascinated with this idea that, man, Jesus, before Bethlehem, was in the beginning with God. And so his, John's Christmas story, you might say, you read in that first chapter, you go down to verse 14, and it says what? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And it really means and dwelt in us as well, but that's another teaching. But the Word became flesh. Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus just didn't start in a manger, born in a feed trough. John said that Word, Emmanuel, was with God face to face in the beginning. And Paul gets into this as well, but John's captivated by that idea. Hey, Paul and John basically wrote the New Testament. Anyway, they're the main authors, and they're the ones that had the grandest view and understanding of Jesus, more than just a babe in a manger. John goes on in several places and says, man, Jesus was the bread from heaven, the bread of life, and here's this manger, the Word made flesh in a feed trough, who ultimately becomes our food. Our very life comes to feed us from heaven with a piece, a touch, a taste of heaven. Man, I'm getting carried away here. But so he's asking that. He's introducing us to that Jesus who is before Bethlehem, in the beginning with God. And then he seems to be, John, fascinated with this idea of, and this question of, where did he go? Where did Jesus go after his death, resurrection, and ascension? Where is he now? And John authors the book of Revelation. John had a revelation, and again, he steps up to the plate in verse 1 of Revelation, chapter 1. This is the revelation of Jesus Christ, and John is all about revealing and showing us who Jesus really is. Just wasn't only a man who lived for 33 years, as fantastic and amazing as that is. This is the one who was face to face with God in the beginning and now exists at the ending and beyond the end and is the summation of all things. That's a little taste. Okay. One other thing I want to point out in this segment. The mosquitoes are out. That's why I'm reaching around and itching. Oh man, look at this sunset. I've got to grab this and just see if I can. Oops. Can you see that? That's fantastic. Okay. The one who created the heavens and the earth, that beautiful sky, is the one who created you. And when he looks at you, he does somersaults, just like looking at that beautiful sky and going, whoa. Anyway, oh my, where was I? Okay, so there's an expression in John 4 times, and the expression is this: the disciple whom Jesus loved. 4 times. John 13, John 20, and John chapter 21 several times. The disciple whom Jesus loved. That always puzzled me. And then twice, along with that description, is a depiction of this one that Jesus loved, leaning his head up against the chest, the very bosom of Jesus. You know, as if to tell us there was a disciple that was extra close, had a special connection with Jesus. And who is this one? Who is this disciple whom Jesus loved? Well, in practically the last verse of the last chapter of the Gospel of John, John tells us. It says, and this is the one who testifies and is writing of these things. John identifies himself as the one whom Jesus loved. And I just, again, it's always puzzled me. Does that mean Jesus had a favorite? That he loved one disciple more than the rest? And it just doesn't make sense, because if one of the reasons Jesus came was to reveal the father heart of God, that doesn't sound like a very fair father, that he would love some of his children more than he loves the rest of them. So I don't think that was the point that John was trying to get across, that he wasn't trying to tell us something about Jesus, that Jesus had favorites. No, he was expressing how he felt about himself, his own perception of who he was. I am a disciple whom this Jesus loves. And over the course of his life, remember, 60 years he's drawing from, and over that time, he came to know ever more clearly, became ever more aware of this love, this encounter with this risen Jesus. And this is the one that he wants to describe and tell us about and bring to our attention through his gospel. And so we're going to look at a few more things about John's gospel, about this Jesus who he came to know very intimately, not just as a disciple for 3 years, but as an apostle, as a leader, as the very friend of Jesus for decades following those brief 3 years that he walked with him. Okay, there you have it. We'll pick up where I left off here in the next video. Thanks again for checking this out. Views from the road. We'll see you next time.